Hello audience, and welcome to another dual book review here on the channel that I'm calling the Sequel Partnership. I just thought of that in the moment, can you believe it? Because today we're going to be talking about the Elfstone of Shannara and the Fury of the Gods by Terry Brooks and John Gwynne respectively. And I'm really excited to get into both of these here. Don't worry, it's going to be spoiler-free, kind of just giving you that, hey, is the series worth the investment type approach, while also doing my damn job the best I can. But let's go ahead and kick it off with the first book of the two, and that is going to be the Elfstone of Shannara. And boy, am I thrilled to say this is a step up from the first book, and pretty much what I was looking for from the first book. Sirens. And pretty much what I was looking for from the first book through and through. Terry Brooks has not only improved his prose, but the story itself, the expansion of the world, and especially
the info dumping
have been smoothed over and become a much more enjoyable experience. But even on that, in my sort of Shannara review, I compared it to The Wheel of Time and how it's kind of like another interpretation of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. That maintains to be the case, except this is when, you know how like everyone says for The Wheel of Time, the Shadow Rising is when that series kind of becomes its full like blossomed good self. Like the second book of Wheel of Time, it still feels like a different subgenre of epic fantasy. The third book gets a little bit darker, a little bit spookier, and then in the fourth book, it really blossoms into feeling like the full potential of Watt. The second book, I'm happy to say, seems to be where the Sword of Shannara has managed to capture that exact same feeling. It does kind of bloom out from those Tolkien-inspired roots and feel distinctly itself, while absolutely still being head over heels in love with the classic fantasy genre that inspired it. But just getting into more of the details that have improved over the first book, the Elfstone of Shannara has a better rounded cast of characters, including female ones with agency and all kinds of personality. Yay! In fact, might be my favorite character from this book. I always enjoy a female elf protagonist. Unfortunately, there is a bit of a love triangle in here, but it's not overdone and feels just like age appropriate for the characters that we have at play. And speaking of the characters we have at play, a good way for this to have broken free of a lot of the baggage that was still left over from the Sword of Shannara was taking a generational step forward, which, yes, absolutely is happening here in Elfstone, with only a few characters from the first book showing up to play a major role. And interestingly, I really love how Terry Brooks managed to, like in the first Sword of Shannara book, it kind of seemed like the end-all be-all threat. How could we possibly top that? Terry Brooks answers that question by just expanding his lore and doing some real from the roots up groundwork without many retcons or anything to make this just feel like a more vibrant and lethal fantasy story. That's something that I think is distinct to the Sword of Shannara. This is not grimdark. This is not a story where you need to be like emotionally, prepared to go through whatever the narrative is. But at the same time, without spoilers, fuckers die. Terry Brooks is not afraid to make sure if a stupid choice is made or someone is confronted that shouldn't be confronted yet, the consequences will be paid. And so there's this balance where in the Wheel of Time, like one of the criticisms of that series is you go many books without people dying. It seems like the Sword of Shannara does not want you to have that comfort. And so despite it being still a lot of the same cozy vibes you get from the first book at times, it never fully loses that tension that I think good fantasy should have when you have big, mystic, epic going on. I want to praise something that I feel like Terry Brooks does not get enough credit for, and that is badass battles. I think the Sword of Shannara had a great battle in it, and the battle that takes place here within Elfstone, it only builds upon the foundations of what we saw there and improves just as much as other elements of Terry Brooks' writing. So I think Shannara has really great slish-slash, scale big, ha-ha time. And something I want to compliment Terry Brooks on as an author, characterization is a strong suit of his. I mean, I already thought his characters were good enough in the Sword of Shannara. How I've seen he's improved for Elfstone, it's now one of my favorite qualities of him as a writer. But specifically, Terry Brooks is able to introduce characters late in a book. Like, there's people we meet here in the last third that end up having enough personality and motivation and effect on the story to feel completely justified. And usually if I'm talking to someone who is like just starting out as a writer, I push them away from introducing anyone past the first act who's going to be like a major heavyweight on the protagonist side. But no, not only is Terry Brooks going to immediately charm me with a new character who has a good old togo, but that character ends up kind of just being dedicated enough to without being distracting. It's a wonderful balance that I think he specifically handles magnificently deftly. Characterization is something that takes precision. And I probably spent a little too much time in my sort of genre review dumping on its info dumps, which there was one dump here in the Elfstone that I was like, this feels like we're approaching on that territory. But in general, it is far more smoothed over. And it's proven to me that Terry Brooks, if this is the continued track for like the quality of Shannara, even if it just levels off here and stays as solid as Elfstone, that he deserves the reputation that he has. I do still have a couple criticisms. I said his prose have improved. I don't think Terry Brooks, he's kind of in this awkward position where he's not like a lot of the modern, just like whatever prose writers you get in fantasy, people who don't really try to be more like Tolkien. There's scenes where Terry Brooks is trying to elevate his writing, but technically there's this disconnect where it's just not quite there. And so it's a little more awkward than if it tried to just stay in that more casual setting. Does that make sense? Overall, the book, pacing and structure, I find to be fine. There could be a case that things could be tightened up or actually just made even slower if you want to increase those cozy vibes that Shannara kind of verges into at times. But for me, this is the Shannara book that finally was what I wanted from the Shannara series. Granted, it's only the second one, but like that's just a good thing. It means I was able to really quickly actually get to the point that I was expecting from what is considered like such a monolith within the genre. Couple last minute things. I specifically mentioned that Alanon in the first book kind of drove me nuts, like my least favorite version of a type of character, the big badass wizard that I usually love. Elfstone for me kind of intentionally reinvented the character where not only now is he not just info dump man, but his personality comes across way different, which you can justify because there's a massive time skip and people change, even awesome badass wizards. And through that re-envisioning of a character who's supposed to know more, be above all, that becomes an extension of Terry Brooks's improvement for like setup, foreshadowing, or it doesn't feel so obvious and you can't call nearly as much of this book as you could in the first entry. So my final message is, if you, like me, you read Sword of Shannara and you were kind of underwhelmed, keep going. The second book, I would say easily several points above. In fact, I'm going to give the Elfstone of Shannara a very solid 8 out of 10. And this is going to take me to Fury of the Gods by John Gwynne, which is another sequel. And in case you missed it, on my second channel, Sheveled Goblin, I went ahead and interviewed Mr. Gwynne, and we talked about writing this book, his process as an author, what he's been through recently. Highly recommend you check it out.
Bulk of the writing really happened in probably 4 months. So it's by far the fastest book I've written.
That is like Stephen King levels right there, man.
Yeah.
That is impressive. But when it comes to my thoughts on this actual book, I'm conflicted. Okay, this is gonna sound, keeping it completely spoiler free, because this is the conclusion of a series. There is a trap that a lot of conclusions to, especially trilogies in my opinion, can fall into, where they have so much to wrap up, it can just become constant action to the point of detriment to other aspects of the story. Fury of the Gods is falling into that trap. There is so much happening and so much overt action that characterization and some moments that feel like they should have been given more room to breathe were not given that. But that does not mean this is a bad book. It's just an area of criticism I personally have. I actually think in terms of like the narrative level, what happens to
payoff
so much of what's been, established in Shadow of the Gods and, oh my God, what's the second book? Hunger of the Gods. Like, I actually really enjoy every decision that is made. It's just that on a writing level, I needed there to be some more time for me to really feel the emotional impact that was supposed to be delivered, which is kind of contradictory because there really were some poignant emotional moments within Fury of the Gods. The themes of revenge and grief are absolutely vividly realized and described, but the characters don't live them as much as I would like to, right? It's that balance of showing us and telling us that you have to write as an author. I feel like we got too much of one and not enough of the other, which is ironic in this review because I feel like Terry Brooks also really stepped up his emotional communication in Elfstone of Shannara, but I should have just included that in the first part. Back to Fury of the Gods. This by no means, though, is going to be like a disappointing conclusion, I think, to almost anyone who's a fan of the Bloodsworn saga. You absolutely have those just gargantuan moments of, oh my god, that John Gwynne is so good at writing. I think his ferocity with the pen is as poignant as it's ever been, and if you've read John Gwynne books, you know what I'm talking about. And contradictory to what I'm saying to like 50% of the book being dedicated to various kinds of action, John Gwynne's trademark approach to heroism and commentary on being misguided versus being evil is cathartic as with how he manages to actually wrap everything up, because this is an immensely satisfying wrap-up to the Bloodsworn saga. And with the book kicking off with our heroes left off from the second book in such a dire situation, the book immediately earns the final observations on sacrifice and how those who are selfless will always end up being able to outperform those who are selfish. That being said, though, I was left a little bit confused with what happened with a couple of characters, specifically and there were a few deaths that, man, John Gwynne is not willing to make anyone safe. And, you know, there's always that part of me as a reader where I need more time to marinate on where a character kind of ended up, what happened to them, and maybe even do a reread before I can decide, yeah, this whole arc from beginning to end, I really enjoy and love. Because, you know, if you've been reading a book, a series over like several years, it's hard to get that full, clear picture. So, I mean, that's just a good sign that I feel motivated to once again read the Bloodsworn saga by John Gwynne. I guess my final thoughts here are John Gwynne has made himself stand out as an author, as someone who is not only one of the best at action in general, whether it's individual versus individual or battle sequences, and he lives up to that reputation here. It's just that he also was one of the most interesting when it came to the morality of his heroes and villains and the complex growth they had. And while I feel like this book fully delivered on the former part of that appeal, the latter is Arcane Season 2 a smidge. It's just something where I, as a reader, wanted something to slow down, take a breath, and really let some of those moments that still are impactful when they hit, breathe a little bit longer. So for overall, for the conclusion of Fury of the Gods, I'm feeling a weak 7 out of 10, but for the Bloodsworn saga as a whole, I'm feeling a solid 8 as well. Anyway, y'all, thank you so much for doing this quickie catch-up review. I just needed to get done before I pick up and try to get into Wind and Truth. It's a big book. Really excited for it. Big book. And have a beautiful one, y'all. Peace.